Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I didn't think I was talking about this when I arrived this morning. So as a result of this might be quite a short talk, and I might have lots of time for questions, but that's fine. So let me just tell you, and hey, thanks. And actually, those are two really good talks, and I'm always delighted to be on the same schedule as Tony with his enthusiasm and his positivity, and I am one of the other great positivists and enthusiasts for the sector. Despite that, I have some war stories which tell you how tough it can be, and maybe I'll get to some of those. But let me just tell you a little bit about my background and my history without going through the long version. So I am a scientist originally, and then an entrepreneur. I set up one of the UK's first biotech companies, and it was successful, which was great. It actually got products to market, which are currently being used to benefit patients. It employed a lot of people. It bought things outside of the UK. It did lots of deals. It made money, and was one of those success stories. And I came out of that in 1999, knackered. Promised my wife I would take a year on holiday. I have my wife's stories as well. I promised my wife I'd take a year on holiday and singularly failed. And within 3 months, I'd set up 4 companies and I invested in those. I was CEO of 2 of those and became, therefore, sort of accidentally what was called a serial entrepreneur. And I've been doing that ever since. And why have I been doing that ever since? Several reasons. First of all, because it's fabulously interesting and entertaining, and it can impact and do good. Secondly, because the world won't let me alone, and I am very, very attracted by entrepreneurs and the people in the system who make things happen. I'm very, very driven by people. And in fact, who and people and incentives and allowing people to do things is one of the big challenges here. I've never known an entity like health, which actually never talks about the people. It talks about systems and boxes and arrows and pathways and X, Y, and Z, and never asks the question, who? I'll come to that in a few minutes. But since then, I've been investing. I've been founding companies with very often people I know and I like, and investing money. In fact, I've thrown every single penny of everything that I have made, bar the mortgage on the house, not bought a second house, any of those things, back into the sector. My investment committee is my wife. I have to go to her and say, there's another bunch of people I want to invest in. And she's very tolerant of that. And hopefully at the end of the day, it will all come through. So I'm a founder, investor, entrepreneur. I invest in ventures. I invest in social ventures. I do philanthropic stuff. It's almost all in life science and healthcare. And I started in classic biotechnology. And actually, it was very useful what Fiona said, and I'll come to some of that stuff in a minute. I'll talk a little about the classic biotech model, because it is important to understand how things have changed and how we're in a new ecosystem. But over the last few years, I've become very, very interested in broader healthcare, and I've become obsessed with the fact that actually the future, the transformative future of medicine is about data. It's particularly about longitudinal data on the individual, which is what will change over a period of, and a huge amount of what Tony was showing up earlier is longitudinal data capture on individuals, large amounts of data on individuals. The personalization of medicine becomes a lot about that. So now where I'm a sort of investor in 25 companies or so. I'm a chair or director of some 6 companies. I'm a director of CRT, CRU, and CRUK, heavily involved with CRUK. I'm heavily involved in helping with the industrial strategy, where the data component is a really important bit. I'm also a director of COH NHS Trust, otherwise known as Addenbrooke's to most people. And of course, the data issues there are really interesting. The innovation issues are really interesting. And there are some interesting observations that actually there's a massive conflation there of the fact that because there's a huge amount of research, there is therefore an enormous amount of innovation. And innovation and research are not the same thing. But of course, they've invested incredibly heavily in the EPIC data system, which has been painful, but is fantastic and is now really generating results, both in terms of improving pathways, but gives an enormous opportunity of a unique data set to do things with. I'm going to briefly talk about 3 companies which show some examples of data and data outputs from innovative technology improving healthcare, and these highlight some of the issues. However, what I will say, and I think it was brought up earlier, we have some unique opportunities and data sets that they don't have in the US, partly because of that fragmentation, or in other countries because they're not big enough, or in other countries because they haven't collected the data in the right way, or they don't have they don't have a sort of clinical capability to interpret those. We are in a very, very strong position if we can harness it in the right way. And that's much a who question as a what question. So I'll come back to your points about entrepreneurs and who. I'll talk you through 3 examples of companies which have been based on data that could only really have been gathered in the UK for some reason or another, and which are currently trying to do things. The first of these fits some of the challenges, and it fits some of the challenges of healthcare being very regulated, healthcare data having to be analysed and collected in a particular way. We all know about evidence-based medicine control, blinded controlled trials, the only way you ever understand anything. And that's a company called Abcodia. Abcodia comes from a very, very large clinical trial that was done called the UK CTOX trial, set up by Ian Jacobs when he was at Queen Mary's and then went to UCL and then went to Manchester and now is in Australia, and Steve Skates from Mass General, now at Harvard. And it was to look at the early detection of ovarian cancer. Ovarian cancer, of course, very significant medical need. If you diagnose early, outcomes very good. If you diagnose late, as with many cancers, outcomes very bad. And how do you do that when actually there's very low symptoms in the early stages of ovarian cancer? And sure, you can identify risk now through things like BRCA, but still a real challenge. And there was a well-known biomarker which has always been looked at and associated called CA125, which is analysed everywhere. And they had the view that actually the challenge with things like CA125, as in with many other biomarker levels like PSA, is if you set a cutoff level, the variation in the population is larger than the sort of variation within an individual as they go forward. And therefore, you either set the cutoff level at one level, in which you get a massive false positive level, another level you get a massive false negative level. Doesn't really work, not really useful as a screening tool. You end up with either you either don't identify who's got cancer, or you end up with a whole load of surgeries that you don't want. And they said, okay, let's look at this in longitudinal profile. And they did some work, and there was a preliminary study that identified that actually if you looked at not what is the level of CA125, but actually what is the change in the level of CA125, and looked at it over time, you started seeing some interesting things. They put together a very sophisticated Bayesian algorithm that could then lead on to what they called a multimodal study, which would then result in, could then lead on to transvaginal ultrasound. And then they said, in classic mode, how are we going to prove this in a classic sort of evidence-based medicine thing? This is a really hard thing to do, and they went and got the money to do this. You would never have got this money from investors to do this. They got a very large amount of money from charities and NIHR to follow 200,000 women for close on 15 years. And in fact, the study is still going, taking blood samples. These are well women between 50 and 60. These aren't ill women. And this is following them and looking at their blood levels. And when you do that, you can, and the study is still going on and it's still reading out, and hopefully in a few years there'll actually be a mortality benefit in this, but there's certainly a survival benefit and a stageship benefit that you can actually identify those. Now, this is an algorithm. This isn't a test, CA125 test is really one. This is an algorithm. This is a data-associated business. And Avcodia was set up to both try and get that test into classic healthcare, which you suddenly come against the problem of how do you do that in a regulatory system. Well, first of all, how do you do that within a system like, you know, the UK and the NHS? But actually, no investors in that sort of world believe that the NHS is going to be the significant market. And then you have to realize, how do you get it into the US? How do you get it through US, you know, through the FDA? How do you get something like that reimbursed when basically you've got a very cheap test, but actually what you're doing is a huge amount of investment in an algorithm that's going to improve the sensitivity and the specificity of that test to the stage where it becomes useful as a screening tool. It's difficult. Let me come to another one, and I'm very pleased that Phil Beals from UCL is here in the audience. So a few years ago, set up with Phil and a group from Sanger Centre in Cambridge, a company called Congenica. Congenica is been set up to use genomic-type technology, much the sort of stuff that Fiona was talking about, to solve the challenge of the diagnostic odyssey of people with inherited diseases. Classic situation, particularly in developmental disorders. Kids have a problem, and then they go from pillar to post, test, one single test after one single test. Each single test costs, and consultations around it costs maybe multiple hundreds of pounds, but the average diagnosis period is, what, 5 years, Phil? Something like that, 5 to 8 years. And you look at the cost of the system of that, you look at the cost of the parents of that, you look at that whole situation. Well, lots of single one-gene tests, you can do a whole exome, a whole clinical exome for 200, 300 pounds. The interpretation is then more of a challenge. You can do a whole genome for less than 1,000, and that will be cheap soon. The interpretation is even more expensive and difficult then. So Congenica came from a study, from working with clinicians like Phil, and a study that had been put together in the UK that, again, could only have been put together in the UK. A study called the DDD Project, Deciphering Developmental Disorders, where all of the difficult-to-diagnose developmental challenges throughout the UK were fed in to a system that then looked at that phenotype-genotype mix through work that Matt Hurls and Richard Durbin had done at Sanger Centre. And it was really the use of the technology that had come together to put that in place and then trying to get that into the system. That is a study and the knowledge from that study that could only have been done in the UK. The scale of the UK and the fact that it was collaborative and could share all of that data. Now, Congenica is a tech business. It's a digital health business. It's not doing sequencing. It is analysing data. And then it hits some of the problems that Fiona talked about how do investors see it, how do business models work in that spectrum. But it's also trying to get into healthcare, and there's a real challenge there, where what you're really doing is saving a healthcare system money of that enormous diagnostic odyssey. And a healthcare system in the UK can't tell you what that costs. And certainly can't identify which bits of a budget are currently going towards it. And, you know, if you could go to them and say, we will save you X, they don't know where you're saving it from, because they don't have the bits of, you know, and that's a challenge in these sorts of healthcare money systems, let alone then how you get that into other healthcare systems. Of course, in the US, that means you have to get it regulated through the FDA, back to the whole things I talked about earlier. But in the UK, we had an initiative, which was a very important initiative called Genomics England, which has started to try and develop a pathway. I wouldn't say it had done it in the clearest, cleanest way, but its intent has been good and it's been moving in the right direction of trying to bring those technologies into the NHS and also create an ecosystem. Congenica has certainly been a beneficiary of that, because we won very early on what's called one of the Genomic England bake-offs, where we demonstrated that our interpretation technology was actually better than a lot of those very large companies around the world, which was great to see. And although we hadn't got very much money or revenue from it, the credibility and our ability to demonstrate traction on those sorts of samples resulting in real diagnoses is viewed around the world as very important. That has allowed us to get significant amounts of investment, just closed more than £10 million round. And that round was not to grow the company in the UK, just in the UK, yes, in the UK, but to get it into America, but more importantly, to get it into China. Because China is leapfrogging to next generation medicine. So we've got 2 Chinese corporates that we've now are now working with, and Chinese investors who have come in to break into that market. So it is possible then to think about internationally these things. But what that business model is still a challenge, because basically you're saving healthcare systems using technology, something they can't identify and they can't tell you who you're saving it from. The third one is a company called IESO Digital Health, which I'm also particularly pleased with. So IESO Digital Health came from a study, again done in the UK, by an academic who, and it's based on remote cognitive behavioural therapy, live remote cognitive behavioural therapy with a therapist at a distance. And you would immediately expect that that was being done by video or by phone or something like that. No. This is done via a written conversation. You can pejoratively call it a text conversation, but it's actually a detailed written conversation. And there was an academic who'd done a study who'd recognized that actually there may be some benefits in that, and did a study, which was published in The Lancet, that actually showed very encouraging results using this approach of CBT. And we founded IESO, what's originally called Psychology Online, to actually take that technology and prove it. We got money from angel investors. I'm in an angel group. That actually someone from the back is also in the angel group. Hi, Randy. But it was very interesting because in that system, there were a set of investors from the life science side who said, prove that it works. Show clinically its worth, and a set from the tech side who says, just sell the damn thing. High net worth individuals, you know, they've all got mental health, you know, they've all got depression, just sell it. Yeah? We made a very courageous decision. We knew that the UK had, again, uniquely invested in a data set through the IAPT program, Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, which was a unique data set where you could actually compare real-world data, how this approach compared with standard of care therapy. And so we raised more money than we would have to. We spent longer and got it into the NHS, which everyone told us was a very bad idea from an investor viewpoint, and proved that actually remote cognitive behavioural therapy, when done well, through a written conversation, is better than face-to-face therapy. Fewer therapy sessions to get to outcome, improved access, fewer dropouts, and actually a hugely detailed textual database of the whole conversation that allows you to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to improve the system. And what do we mean by improving the system? Yes, that's identifying through natural language processing what sorts of techniques and motifs work for the individual patient, but more importantly, tells each therapist the combined knowledge of thousands and thousands of hours of work on what works for this particular patient, giving this particular utterance at that particular time with that particular condition. And that's a unique data set. That business, after going through a number of angel investments, has now got major venture money and is breaking into the US. And it turns out when you go to the US, they have no data. They have an absolutely primitive data set on what they call behavioral health. And that puts us in a very strong position. So there are 3 examples of where there is data that you can use and gather in the UK that actually can give you a world-leading position. So there are lots of challenges with building businesses based on data and innovation. There's, of course, the data itself. There's access to the data. There's the ethics, the security of gaining that data. There's the technology and the interpretation. And then there's the translation and how you get it out there. But as an entrepreneur and as an investor, I want to talk to you about 1 or 2 things that actually are particular, I think. First of all, the UK science-based and research-based is fantastic, and actually there are lots of ideas and there are lots of innovators. They're a bit diffuse, they're not connected, they could do with being more concentrated, they could do with that sort of cluster effect of actually not feeling too lonely and making courageous decisions together. That's actually what a cluster is. A cluster is a low-risk environment for an individual to take a high risk. That's the cultural aspect of it. There are actually lots of entrepreneurs, and actually there's lots and lots of investors. There is no shortage of money, globally or in the UK, to invest in really good innovation and business models. But there are some problems. This is a new ecosystem. And that ecosystem needs to evolve. It needs to evolve in terms of what's sensible things to invest in, what are the business models, how do people make money, how do people scale, how quickly, what are the exits from all of that. And at the moment, we're in a situation in that world where we have 2 tribes. These are the 2 tribes that Fiona talked about. There's a tribe that comes from traditional life sciences and biotech. That's my original world. And that model's a really interesting one, because what are you doing there? You are trying to do something that fundamentally will fail, statistically. You're trying to discover a new drug. Well, every drug fails. 1 in how many thousand get through, and it's going to cost you hundreds of millions to get there and take you 15 years. Well, that's a pretty lousy investment proposition, but it's built up a business model. And that business model is there's a set of very hungry big companies at the end, Pfizer, GSK, Merck, Johnson & Johnson. If you generate the right data, and the right data in this case, actually all those businesses are data businesses, the right data is a patent that is rock solid, that's going to protect the entity out the other end, data to show at the stage it's at, preclinical, proof of concept clinical, regulatory clinical, that it works. You can license or sell those packages for huge amounts of money. And investors invest in taking those. However, there is still a statistical punt, and that's the reason why most life sciences investors focus on, we do drug discovery, we invest in 15 companies, one of them is going to come good. And one of them is going to sell for that, and we don't worry too much about the other 14. And as soon as you start diverting from that business model, you're in real trouble. That's that, and it's based on intellectual property, and it's global. And actually, do you know the problem with it? From my perspective as an individual here, the least and the last people that benefit from that are UK patients. And the reason that it's the least and the last is because the NHS is lousy at the uptake of new medicines for a whole set of reasons, and I'm not going to go into those. That wasn't a political statement. That wasn't a statement about pricing. It was there for a whole set of reasons. And when you sit on entities like CRUK, it's a real problem, because actually everyone who's doing the race for life and doing it because of a relative who died or whatever, they're doing it looking around the room, thinking about their daughter, their mother, their sister. And actually, the least and the last people who benefit from those are those people. The innovations get done. You license it over to Merck. Merck sells it throughout the world, mostly in the US, and actually the UK is too small a market, can't be really bothered. This is not very satisfactory. But that tribe invests in those sorts of things. It doesn't do things that sell into the NHS. Then there's the tech world. The tech world, classically, is in areas where there's a very low barriers to entry. They're selling software. And they have a metric which is about revenue. revenue growth is everything. And as soon as you start trying to sell things into a complicated entity like the NHS, difficult to convince clinicians, complicated single-point buyer or fragmented, very slow. The one thing you don't get is revenue growth. And so that looks horribly unattractive for them. And as soon as they're in any innovation in healthcare, their instinct is to veer off into Consumerville and sell it to high net worth individuals who are into fitness. And it really doesn't matter whether it works or not, as long as you're selling it. This is also very unsatisfactory. And so bringing these two sets together is really important, because it's that middle set of people who understand data, understand clinical benefit, and are willing to build new business models which are protectable and globally exploitable, because no investors, with the exception of people who invest in pubs and restaurants and little things like that, no investors invest in tech businesses for this little country alone. So, what do we need to do? Well, we need to address those things and bring that model together. The second thing is who? Investors invest in people. They don't invest in business plans. They invest in Fiona. The investors who've invested in Fiona like Fiona and they like her story. It's a who story, and we have to bring those who's together. The NHS is very, very bad at thinking about who. Who is innovating, and how do we identify, encourage, and incentivize them? And Tony's doing a fab job at trying to put this together, but also make them not lonely, bring them together with the entrepreneurs who can develop their business model and the investors who can help evolve their business models to make it a success. And it is about new business models. What are we selling to who? How do we realize the value? How do we take the value from what's being done in the UK market, or the UK healthcare system? And by the way, anyone who actually has traction, and what traction might not mean money, traction might mean demonstration that something does something valuable in a clinical pathway in the UK, that has hugely high credibility around the world. And that is therefore something, if you can capture it, that it can be, exploited. But it's hard, and we still have a lot of things to fight about. And I will end up with one of my most depressing days. I'll take it down. I'll shark it, as my 17-year-old daughter calls it, when there's a conversation, and I shark up and drag it down to the depths. I was at there's a very great, good organisation called the Foundation of Science and Technology. I don't know who knows you probably do, Hakim. Foundation of Science and Technology holds dues at the Royal Society with good and great from the science and technology world, with the House of Lords, actually more than the House of Commons, and debates and discusses difficult issues like climate change, like AI, like driverless cars, like the industrial strategy. And a few years ago, they held a do on dementia, which is an area that I've done a significant amount of work on early detection, early diagnosis in, and is clearly a serious medical challenge. And it was really, really depressing. Yeah, really depressing. Why was it depressing? There was enormous discussion from huge numbers of people in the system about the system. There were boxes and arrows, there were pathways, there was the system. There was virtually no discussion about the individuals and their carers and the contribution that those people could make to improving the system. There was no recognition that this was a problem that occurred anywhere other than within the UK. This was entirely a UK problem. We couldn't learn from anyone else, anywhere else. And it was entirely a public sector problem. There was nothing that anyone outside of that bubble could do, let alone anything to do with innovation or technology. The words innovation and technology and anything new coming down the pipeline were not mentioned. And I said, oh, this is dreadful. And after that, you go to dinner. And I went to dinner and I sat there, uncharacteristically for me, not fizzing. And I said, oh, that was awful. The person beside me said, why was that awful? I said, well, explain those factors. And she said, well, you know, I'm a research nurse in a London teaching hospital. I won't say which one. And she said, we've been doing some innovation. I said, fab, what have you been doing? She said, well, we've put together a data system, software system, for helping carers to manage patients. I said, does it work? And she said, yeah, no, it's really, really good. It helps on all sorts of things. I said, and how are you translating it? She said, that's where it gets really hard. You see, because that sort of thing, people don't want to publish that in high-rank journals. So you can't really get it out there. You can only publish it in a low-rank journal, and then it takes years and years to get it out. And I'm saying, but this is software. Surely you can get software out there. She said, yeah, no, we got contacted by a software company. I thought, wow, this is fab. Who was interested in taking this out and translating it? I said, and we had a discussion. I said, well, that's not sort of what you do within the NHS. I'll finish at that point.